It's great to have you on. You head up Whitten and Roy Partnership, which we probably referred to as WRP, if that's okay, as we go along. With WRP,
Yeah.
you're really bringing a desire to transform sales to do good. And I'd love to explore that in more detail. But really, you're helping organizations with their sales processes, but also leadership and management training, if I understand this correctly. You're also the author of two
Sure.
books,
Right.
host your own podcast, and I think you've worked with over 500 clients in more than 50 countries in, say, the last 15 plus years. So you work with social enterprises on one hand, but you also work on sharing your
Mhm.
proprietary DQ selling method in perhaps the more companies or organizations in the West. I'm curious, in the lead up to the creation of WRP, you've worked in sales capacity, certainly in nonprofits as well. What led to this partnership and the creation of WRP as we know it today?
Well, that's a question I'm going to figure out a way to answer in a truncated manner. I was in sales. I started in sales in, see, that would have been 1977. And I was just in college and I needed to make enough
Mm,
money for my college education because my parents couldn't pay for it anymore because due to circumstances. So I got a job
mm,
selling educational books door to door. And it was a really great experience, quite frankly. And it was the hardest job I ever did, I promise you. But it also it gave me the skills and capabilities that I still draw on today. And so I did that for 5 summers during my summer
mm,
during college. And then I went on professionally and worked with them for 6 years. So that's really, that's the foundation of my selling skills was I got lucky and got trained
mm,
by a very good company here in America. It's one of the oldest companies called the Southwestern Company. And in fact, even today and over the last 15 years, a good number of the consultants that we have brought into our business are graduates of that
mm,
program because that training is just that good. And, but anyway, what happened between the years of there and here, I built an insurance company with a couple of partners from scratch. So that took me to about the age of about 40, 42. And then I retired from that.
mm.
And I thought I was going to be retired from that point forward. But that lasted about 6 months. And then I got into nonprofit management and did some nonprofit lobbying. And eventually in 2005, got into consulting. And there I ran into an old partner, a friend of mine that had led a training program. His name is Roy Whitten. And his training was, I'll get into that a little bit in just a little bit, I'm sure. But his training was very different. He didn't have a sales background, but he had a
Mm.
background in human transformation. And so we started working together from 2005 forward. And then in 2008, we decided to start our own company. And 2009 is when things all kicked off. And that's how we started in central
Okay,
London working
brilliant.
with major.
In the journey to date, I'm also curious about what you would say would be your personal area of strength.
Certainly the area that I have is the soup to nuts of how to build a sales organization and how do you recruit, train, manage, motivate? How do you compensate? How do you deal with underperformance? How do you get a sales engine in your company so that it performs consistently and predictably and
So,
that
in
you
that
can
area of
replicate?
strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
I think that there are a number of things that you need to know. One of the key things is when you have a sales team, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in that team, the top people in that team can rise to become sales managers without some sort of training and
Mhm.
instruction to teach them how to be really great as sales managers because there are different skills in sales management that run counter to what you learn as a salesperson. Like in sales, as a salesperson, you need to be a bit selfish with your time so that you can guard against people dragging you away from sales activities. But in sales management, that selfishness has to disappear because you need to be spending your time with the people who are helping you sell. That's certainly a key thing. I think another thing that I would say is when you hire, you certainly want to hire for attitude. And what I mean by that is not somebody who always will have a great attitude, but someone who is open to learning and wanting to learn. And I would say the third area of I see most often is the inability of businesses to be able to handle the attitudinal or emotional mindset of people to help them perform. That's one of the most underrated and underappreciated
Yeah,
components
and that's,
of
as
sales
I understand
performance.
this, something you focus on quite heavily. In fact, you've developed what I believe you call the race equation. So I wonder if you could expand on that, tell us what it's about, but also
Sure.
why this
Absolutely.
focus on attitude when most sales training focuses quite heavily on competence
Mhm.
initially.
Absolutely. Competence is just as important, but as you mentioned, at the race framework, it's R equals A plus C plus E. And I figured this out, or at least developed this back
Mm.
when I was about 28 and managing about 150 salespeople and managers. And I was pulling my hair out trying to figure out what to do about. And so I started thinking of it in terms of the results that you're able to produce come from three factors. And one is attitude, one is competence, and one is execution. Okay. So it's like R equals A plus C plus E. So the attitude or the mindset, the confidence, the ability to bounce back, the level of
Mhm.
commitment that people have. In sales, it's so easy to make excuses why people aren't buying. Oh, it's the product. Oh, it's the economy. Oh, it's our pricing structure.
Mhm.
Anything but me. It's what we oftentimes say is that if we want to really boil it down to the essence of what we mean by attitude, it's are you committed or are you hedging or holding back
Mhm.
or looking for a trap door? People who are great at sales are absolutely 100% committed and
Mhm.
they make no excuses. Okay. Competence, you're absolutely right. You really want to, if you're a business owner, you want to set up the opportunity for salespeople to be trained well, because otherwise you're going to have people who just go out and based on their own past experiences as salespeople, probably not trained very well where they came from. Otherwise, they would probably still be where they were. And oftentimes we see people just get into pitching very quickly. They assume that they know what the customer's problems are. They assume that the customer knows what the customer's problems are. And both of those are really not true. Not most of the time, it's not true. And so we want to teach people how to really listen and learn from a customer what the issues are, what the problems are that they're trying to solve, and help them understand them at a much deeper level. We want to start with things like how
Mhm.
do you establish rapport with a customer? And how do you build credibility? How do you get someone to trust you? How do you listen and learn how to listen in such a way that it builds that trust and gets people to think more deeply? We're not so worried about the product
Mhm.
demonstration and all of that because that all can be learned very easily in comparison to the skills of selling. But then how do you close the sale? How do you lead a client through a good buying process? And how do you involve other stakeholders if it's a more complex sale? It's more than a one call close. How do you get finance to be as excited as the CEO, as excited as the other departments, the operations department or computer department or whatever it might be? And so those competencies around sales, and I'll
Mhm.
also stretch that to sales management. The sales managers need to be competent as well, and they need to be trained how to be good sales managers. That will help to build the confidence of both your sales team and your sales managers that they know at least they have the tools in the toolbox, and eventually they're going to get good at using those tools. And then execution, which is the E of race, is how are you spending your time? And who are you spending your time with? And in other words, are you spending the right time with the right people? And are you doing the right things? You say, and because if any one of those is a wrong, you're doing the wrong things with the
Mhm.
right people at the right time,
Yep.
you can see that it's not going to work, right? And so therefore, oftentimes we find people with high inefficiency in what they do. And so we literally are outside eyes that help them rearrange the activities of a sales team or a sales management team so that they're highly efficient and they're very good at doing the right things at the right time with the right people, whether it's sales or management. So those three things, attitude, competence, and execution, are the lenses through which we look when we're
Mhm.
analyzing a sales organization and the sales team's performance. And there are no mysteries at all.
Mhm.
Okay. It's there right in front of you. Recently, we were working with a client, or in fact, we're currently working with a client in Bangladesh. And this is in our social impact space. And we're working around the sale of eyeglasses, okay? Eyeglasses that cure presbyopia, which is that nearsightedness, that when people get older, right? Or farsightedness, that fuzzy vision and all this kind of thing. They had an historical closing rate of 42% over a 10-year period. We got in there, did the analysis, found the things that they weren't doing right, a lot of it around sales engagement, and their sales performance jumped to almost 80% within 6 weeks. Okay. So sometimes it requires those outside eyes. And oftentimes that's when our phone rings or we get an email, is people are basically at the end of the rope. They've done what they know how to do to make it different, and it's not changing. Now, we wish we could work
Mhm.
with people a bit earlier than that. It doesn't have to get that bad, but oftentimes people want to do it themselves, and that's fine. When we get called in, then we analyze it and figure out what needs to change. We report on that to the client. We let them know what they're going to need to do to make that change, and then we
I'd
help them
imagine
change.
there's perhaps a young founder who is listening to this and going, Scott, you're focusing very much on soft skills with the attitude and competence part at the very least, which at the moment doesn't matter so much because I've got AI on my side. And really, the focus for us is execution
Hmm.
because we can get AI to cover a lot of these soft skills for us, even though we may not be particularly well equipped to create the right impressions, which means we just need to focus on execution. What would you say to such a person?
I think, okay, so if you're looking at your sales performance as an organization and you're performing at the level you want to with your AI,
Hmm.
fine, go ahead and do it. You don't need to worry about soft skills if you can employ it in that fashion. What I also would say is that besides the AI that you use, I'm assuming there's maybe more than just one person in the company, and you have people who also work in the company. It could be people who are designing the application of AI. You might have a finance person. You might also have a team that help with operations. I don't know. It depends on the company's configuration. But those soft people skills
Hmm.
are what build culture. And whether it's for sales or management or customer service or whatever, those soft skills are between human beings and are really important, because if you want to build a culture of high performance in your team, in your organization, whether it's, again, sales or not sales, is that unless you consciously build culture, it
Hmm.
will be built
Well, that
unconsciously. And so therefore one day you'll wake up and the problems that you have are as a result of not being conscious
mhm,
about the culture that
certainly,
you've built,
and
usually. And culture, just to define it, pardon me for interrupting you, culture, to define that, is
mhm.
is the way we do things around here. Okay, the way we do things around here is, and then you described that, and it's the habit patterns or the ways that we perform. And if anything in there is substandard, you've knitted that into
So
the fabric of.
I would just add that perhaps AI is more of an amplifier of the attitudes and competencies we hold. So while we
Yeah.
might initially be able to create
Hmm.
something of a facade of being relational or more relational than others, over time, the true attitudes will come out and be amplified. And unless that's resolved, you still have a problem. Just to add a slightly different perspective of what you're saying.
Yeah. Great point.
But you make a great point there. And I think in our last conversation, you mentioned that selling in Ghana isn't very much different from selling to Hitachi, which also goes against conventional wisdom about cultural differences in sales and being aware of that and adapting to those situations.
Right.
Could you expand on your thinking around why that doesn't matter so much?
Sure. Yeah, I came by this very accidentally, quite frankly, because I believed that culture would be a real dominant force in how
Hmm.
people would receive a sales presentation. Okay. So when I was in 2007, I was living in London, And I decided to do a service
Mm,
project over in Cambodia. And this was very foreign to me, okay, to go from being in an urban environment, selling high dollar type of, or working with companies that sell high dollar equipment, et cetera, to now going in to work for an organization called VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas. And I did a 6-month project in the livelihood sector to see if very small enterprises would be a good way
mm,
to help solve poverty. And so I did some research when I first got there. Yeah, I'm talking about basic thatched
mm,
houses on stilts. And we're talking about the exact opposite of anything that I had been doing before. And so in that experience, I
mm,
watched people selling, and I was really surprised to hear the same objections. I was hearing the same sort of patter as what would happen in the United States or in Europe, and it's the exposure I had in Europe as well. And all of a sudden, I realized that there really wasn't that much difference between selling toilets in India versus selling computer
mm,
software in Indiana. Or I don't have very many funny puns like that, but my point is this, is that selling
mm,
involves typically two human beings. And one human being, their job is to find out the problems of the other human being. And then if they have a solution to those problems, then they present those solutions to those problems, match them up, the deal is done. Okay. Now, obviously, there are going to be differences in Cambodia with respect to the price tag or with respect to the product that's being sold, right? So
mm.
just like we don't sell latrines in London, we don't sell fish and chips in Cambodia, right? So the product is different, definitely, but the process is not. And we've proven this over and over again over in 53 countries all around the world, in literally 6 continents, that this is the
Certainly.
case.
Would you say also that in a lot of cases, salespeople in particular, are fairly poor at the diagnostic piece of selling? And
Yeah.
uh,
Oh, go ahead.
so,
Sorry.
what
Sorry.
specific skills in that area would you say are missing, and how would you suggest people go about being aware of it and addressing it?
A great question. This is all based around our philosophy of
Hmm.
selling, which we call decision intelligence selling, or DQ selling for short. And in DQ selling, there are 4 steps. Okay. The first step is finding out the problem and really
Mm,
understanding the problem that a client has. Okay. And once that happens, then the second step is, or once the problem is fully fleshed out, and that could be 1 meeting, 2 meetings, 3 meetings, 4 meetings, 5 meetings, whatever. Then once it's fleshed out, then a really smart salesperson will help the customer to figure out what is the cost of that problem. How much is that problem costing the customer? Not the cost of the services you can render or the product you can sell to them, but how much is the
mm,
problem costing them? And only then should they do the third step, which is if the problem's serious enough and it's costly enough, then the sensible question to ask the client is this something that you want to find a solution to? And if it's yes, that's when you take your solution out of the bag, so to speak, and you begin talking about how your product or service can match up to the problem set they have to help solve
mm,
that problem or set of problems that they have. And then finally, the fourth step is to set up what is the expected return on investment. And that should be multiples of the investment, but certainly that arrests the cost of the problem. So those 4 steps are
mm,
what salespeople should be doing. But the problem is that salespeople will short circuit it and they jump right into pitching the solution, or they'll listen very briefly just to hear the
mhm,
words they need to hear to know, oh, okay, this solution will work in this situation, and then just jump in and begin pitching. So, to answer your question further, so first is the philosophy of selling, is that my job is to help understand the problem and help the client understand the problem at a depth that's deep enough so that they can determine whether or not it's a problem
mm,
that's worth solving. So, that's really an important philosophy. The second part is the skill. And the
mm,
skill is to avoid questioning and instead do what we call precision listening. Okay. So questioning, when someone is questioning, so tell me about your problem. And how long have you had that problem? And it's just almost like you're at a doctor's office and you just keep giving your answers one after another, you say. And number one, that doesn't build trust. Number two, that doesn't get to the heart of the problem. Okay. Instead, with precision listening, what we believe is as we listen to the client describe the problem that they have, they might say something very simple. Oh, our CRM just isn't doing the job for us. Oh, really? Okay. What's the problem you're experiencing with that? I see. And then how long have you had that? That would be one way people might go do it. Okay. Instead, if it's okay, yeah, our CRM just isn't doing the trick for us, then this is what precision listening would sound like. It would be, oh, so tell me more about that. Okay. And so then the problem is that we want reports to come out so that we can manage the business better and get operations. And the problem is that the salespeople aren't inputting the data that is accurate or up to date so that we can actually even build those reports and rely on. I see. And then as a salesperson, I say, I see. So what you're saying is your salespeople aren't actually using the CRM in a timely fashion, and you're not trusting the data in there. So therefore you can't trust the reports that are being generated. And so then I stop talking and then they pick up from there and they say, yeah. And then what that means is then we have inaccurate forecasting. And that means oftentimes our production isn't right or our inventory isn't right. And we can't predict our cash flow. I see. So that has a knock-on effect, not just in the sales department, but has a knock-on effect in finance, operations, even manu. And so again, I pause like that at the end of that and nod, and then the person will then continue. And if they don't continue, then I'll say, tell me more about how that impacts your business. You say, so what I'm doing is I'm following the customer, but I'm feeding back to the customer what the customer is telling me. And by doing that, it does two things. One is it acknowledges to him or her that they are being heard accurately. And if I make a mistake in playing it back to them, they will correct me. And then we know we're on the same page. So that's number one. And number two, it gets a client to think more deeply about the impact of the problem, not just the problem itself, the presenting problem, but what's below the surface of that. You say, and that's where the gold is, because it gets people to think more deeply about their problem, which builds trust. And then it also builds concern. Okay. So that's what we mean by precision listening. It's where you literally listen and play back to the client rather than go down a funnel of different questions that you're trying to ask them that you should be asking them.
But that is probably one of the most underrated skills, in my opinion, for people of any profession, let alone sales.
True. That's very true. That's very true. It really gets down to it, Vinay, that it's in our markets today, they're just so competitive, so hotly competitive for most products that the way that you're going to distinguish yourself is not by the product that you sell, but by the manner in which you sell that product. Okay. Products change too quickly. In a digital world, people can rip off your designs so fast. And so from the analog world, like when we worked with a very large massive telecoms provider in the UK, this was the journey we took them on, from moving from the analog world to the digital world. Okay. Essentially, they spent over $3 billion a year just in research and development. And so they had a huge competitive advantage when it was an analog world. But when it became a digital world in the early 2000s, then they were getting ripped off right and left and quickly by smaller, more agile companies who would take a piece of their technology and replicate it with software and then cop their business, basically. So we were brought in to help teach the sellers how to sell in a really, truly consultative way, not you're the big guy on the block with the latest and greatest stuff.
And if I'm not mistaken, a lot of your thinking around that has been influenced by Carl Rogers' psychological principles. Would that be correct?
Yes, especially the precision listening is definitely Carl Rogers. He's one of the most brilliant minds, one of the top, is oftentimes arguably one of the top three psychologists of all time, and next to Jung and Freud. And what he used to do, I'm not a psychologist, but what I understand is that when his patients would come in, he literally would not ask questions, and he would just simply play back to the client what the client said in a way that used not all the client's words, but most of the client's words, or some of the client's words. And that way the client knew they were being heard, but the client could then hear their own words played back to them. And they would say, that's not exactly it. What I really mean to say is, you see, and it helps people to clarify their own thinking and get them to think more deeply. And oftentimes when we teach this technique in a transformational project we work in, we do some role play and we use real life stuff. Like we'll have two people pair up and share a challenge. Each one shares a challenge that they're having at work, a real challenge. And the other person's job is to listen deeply to the other person using precision listening. And it's one of the most exciting things that we teach, because while we're teaching it, people are figuring out a problem at work and they're doing it in real time while being trained how to use the method. And we have people who at the end of the module will say, gosh, I know what I'm going to do next. I know my next step to solve the problem. And it's the same impact when you're selling to another client. And it's the same method we use in teaching management and coaching. It's the same process.
As you're saying that, imagining organizations where sales leaders have this constant tension of, yes, you should go out there and build long-term trust, but there's also the requirement to hit short-term targets. How does your approach to precision listening actually help accelerate sales cycles rather than slow them down?
That's a really great question. This is arguably one of the most unique aspects of this, is that we say that it's our belief, and it's our belief because we sell in this way as well. So we have a lot of experience knowing that this is true, is that when I speed up the process of diagnostic and let's get to a proposal in order to hit my short-term targets, when I speed that up, I invite objections, I invite price objections, I invite all kinds of things that I need to work out farther down the sales cycle or down the sales path, the customer journey to ownership. And oftentimes we'll lose sales because I didn't spend the time on the front end to listen deeply to the problem, to make sure the customer understood the problem, to make sure that motivator is in place, that, oh gosh, we have a problem, we need to solve it, and it's costing us a lot of money. That sense of urgency. People are sometimes sales managers and directors are so eager to get the sales to happen now in this quarter or in this half of the year. But if they do that, then they're inviting all kinds of problems downstream. Whereas if people will sell in a way where they'll listen longer, they linger longer in the listening and learning process, they get a more accurate diagnosis and they get a better and more motivated client who actually has the rocket fuel of urgency based on the cost of the problem that will speed things up. So what we say oftentimes is you want to slow down in this first part to speed up the rest of the sale, rather than rather than speed up on the front end of the sale, just to run into slowing down and resistance as you go forward. If you slow down on the front end and you find out you have other departments that need to have a say in the sale, they need to be on board and brought into that. It's far better to do that on the front end rather than do it later when they're objecting or when the final decision is about to be made. And then you get a massive objection that says it doesn't fit for our budget this year. So it doesn't actually slow it down. It actually slows down a part of the sale, which is the listening and learning part, the diagnostic part, but it speeds up the acceptance of the product, the belief that it's actually going to solve the problem. Because if you have a good diagnosis on the front end, then you do a good job in matching your product and its features and benefits to the problem itself, then there's high confidence that this solution.
What you're saying, I'm just thinking of a particular analogy. I think it was Stephen Covey talking about sharpening the axe before you start cutting the trees and spending more time doing that to ensure you have a really sharp blade, which hastens the process of chopping down trees. I can certainly understand it from that perspective.
Absolutely.
A lot of people, though, salespeople in particular, I've noticed, trip up when, say, a customer starts asking about particular features and pricing, which kind of triggers more of a pitch type response from the salesperson. And this concept of playing back what customers say appears simple. And I believe you have a 4-question framework that starts with what is a problem you're trying to solve to help salespeople keep their orientation, if I can use that expression. But
That's right. That's
I'm
right. It is
curious,
orientation. Yeah.
given that tendency, which I guess is somewhat hardwired or natural to people given other experiences that they've had, how do you ensure that framework really becomes the new orientation, irrespective of what customers or the environment might be throwing at you?
Mm-hmm. Great question, Vinay. Actually, the process that we've devised, the 4 steps, which is again the DQ process, it's simple. It's 4 steps, and if you're selling a latrine in Cambodia, you could do that in 30 minutes, right, with your customer or a group, right? But if you're selling something that's more complex, like let's say, some sort of a cloud solution to a major company that could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, that's going to take probably arguably a year to 2 years to make that sale if it's quite large. And so, but those 4 steps are always taken. It's just sometimes it's stretched out over time. Okay. And so you're right. By having that framework to follow, it's much easier for a salesperson to orient themselves where they are in the sale. And so when they begin to hear a client asking, okay, so what's your pricing structure and all that, and we're way out front at the problem definition, that's really not the right question to be asking at that time. And I'll get to that in a minute about how you handle that. But what we believe is the way that you approach a customer is it will get you onto the right conversation. Okay. And the way you approach a customer, whether it's like an account management and a share of wallet type of selling within an account, or it's trying to land a new account, like a new label. Okay. You always want to look for what we call devising a problem proposition. So for example, if you know that your product really solves, your product might solve 15 problems, but there are 3 to 5 specific high level problems that apply to most organizations, then you devise a problem proposition, not a value proposition. Okay. See, problem proposition, marketing department takes the problems that a client has or that most clients have in a sector, and then they devise a value proposition, right? And then that's what they arm the sales team with. So what we do is we work with marketing to say, no, the value proposition is in step 3. What we're looking for is what is the problem proposition? What are the common problems that, let's say, for example, if you're working in the hospital sector and equipment. So it's like, what are the 3 to 5 key problems that most hospitals have based on the experience of the company that are expensive problems? And so then you devise your marketing material. This may be where you would use AI if you're doing outreach, for example, to formulate outbound communication. Or if you're working within a client, then you're able to spot these problems and begin to have a conversation with a client about it. And it would sound something like this: Charles, I've been working on this account for a number of years, and I'm noticing that you've got X problem, Y problem, Z problem with such and such equipment here at the hospital. And I've done some calculations about this and some estimations, but I'm thinking that this could be costing the hospital corporation anywhere between $8 million on an annual basis. And I wonder if you'd like to have a conversation to explore a solution to that, where we could wipe that cost away. So now I've approached you on a problem, and I've actually done an estimate, a general estimate. It's not so wide, but it's not too narrow. And I've named problems that you have at least one of those problems, hopefully 2, and maybe all 3 of those problems. And so it's a way for a person to say things that the other person can relate to right away. And they go, yeah, we've got one of those problems, or yeah, I would like to talk about that. And so then when we sit down, whether it's then or 2 weeks from then, we have an appointment. Now you're on to the topic of, now let's talk about the problem that you have. You see, now we're onto the right conversation and the right part of the conversation rather than, hey, Charles, let me tell you about the new gizmo we're doing. Let's tell you about the new and improved hospital equipment that we're bringing to market. Because then it's all about the product. You don't know really if the product matches up to the problems.
Mhm.
Charles doesn't necessarily know. Charles, the hospital administrator, doesn't necessarily see the problem in the same way. So therefore, by having the conversation, you begin to find out what are the hot
Mhm.
points, the hot buttons for Charles. What are the things that Charles is really relating to, and which ones are a little less impactful, you say, and which ones are the major ones. In fact, we even ask at the end of the problem definition phase, we'll say, now, Charles, are there any other problems you're having with this particular equipment set? Nope, that's it. Okay. Now, if you were to prioritize and say, this is the top problem, and this is the second top problem that our equipment is causing us, what would they be?
Mhm.
Okay. And so now we've got priorities. Okay. Now we move into the cost of those problems. And so therefore we know we're honing in on what is important to Charles, not what's important to my sales manager or my
Mhm.
head of sales, or for that matter, me. Okay. So then the
Certainly.
process
It
unfolds
makes a
there.
lot of sense. So the questions that you use in your framework, the first one is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? I think the second one is, what is the cost of leaving that problem unsolved?
Cost
The
of the
other two
problems.
would be,
Yep. Yep. So the
okay.
third one is,
Mhm.
what's the solution to the problem? Okay. And whether it's a static solution
Mhm.
or a solution that can be fashioned or tailored or made bespoke to a client, that doesn't, it just depends on the industry or in the product that's being sold. And then finally, what is the value that this product is going to bring me? In other words, what's the return on my investment over a 5-year period or the life of of the product? How much will this yield
Mhm.
based on our use case, the use case that we would be using it for? And therefore, that obviously should be multiples of what I'm paying for it, and certainly needs to address the
Mhm.
cost of the problem by not having that solution. So that's how those numbers work together. So this is the thing that a lot of times salespeople drop out
Mhm.
completely. Let's say they are asking questions and they are getting a good feel for the problem. The biggest mistake I see people make
Mhm.
is they never cost the problem. And the reason they don't cost it is because A, they're shy and they don't want to ask that question because they think it's too intrusive, or it's because the person they're asking it of
Mhm.
doesn't have the answers to it. You say they're afraid they don't have the answers to it. And so what we do is we emphasize really a
Mhm.
back of the envelope. Do you know that expression, a back of the envelope calculation, an estimation of what it might be? So you need to know what are, in preparation for selling like this, you need to know what are the problems that your product typically solves. And then what are the
Mhm.
costs ranges of those problems so that you can be equipped when you go in front of a
Mhm.
client to be able to guide their thinking and to know, what are those cost factors that they should be looking for in order to guide the
Mhm.
client to come up with that figure. A really interesting story. We were selling to a wealth management organization, very successful management organization here in the United States. We were selling our services, and we got to this step of the equation, and we asked Greg, so Greg, the next step is I'm going to step away and develop a skeleton proposal. Your homework is to go away and to calculate or estimate what is the cost of the problem over this 5-year period going forward.
Mhm.
Because you've had this problem for the last 5 years. If you don't do anything about it, you're going to have it for the next 5 years, don't you think? And so, and then here are the categories that you want to look at. And so they agreed. We agreed. We got off the phone. Came back a week later. We presented our. We were before we presented our solution. We asked, "Do you know what the cost of the problem is?" Yeah. And okay, what is it? And so they looked at the number. There were two people on the Zoom call, and they looked at the number and looked up, and Roy, my business partner, was on the call with me, and he sensed that they didn't want to tell us because then they were afraid that we would be benchmarking that and using that as a guide for how much we should charge. Okay, so if it was $1 million problem, we could
Mhm.
charge 500,000, and and so he said, Greg, listen, I don't want you to tell me what the number is. It's not important for me to know what that number is, but it is important for you to know what that number is. Because if that number is not that big, then this is the end of the conversation. But if it is big and it's worth solving, then let's proceed. And so let me ask a real simple question. Is that number big
Mhm.
enough that it's worth solving? And Greg basically said, yeah. So, and so we've done 3 major
Mm.
projects with them over the last 6 years, and it's
Brilliant.
been a delightful.
Research and perhaps my own personal experience would indicate that, especially in B2B scenarios, a lot of buyers are complete a lot of their journey independently before even engaging with sales. I'm curious, how does your diagnostic approach adapt to situations where customers believe that they've already diagnosed their own problems and know what they need in order to be respectful of their research and where they're at, both mentally and otherwise?
Yeah, sure. The way we do this, in fact, this happened recently in the country of, what was it? It was in Rwanda. They'd had a full market research and people came in and did a study. It was like 50 pages. And I read through it and I said, let me ask you a few questions. And so I asked questions that were
Mm,
not answered in that market study. Because when other people are doing research, they're entering into it with the knowledge that they have about what to look for. I know what I'm looking for, and it's very specific to how do we get sales to move, you see. Whereas most other people come in with a wider lens to try to
mhm,
diagnose wider issues. But what I'm looking at is, why are sales not moving? Why are they not hitting their numbers? And so therefore, with that, it doesn't mean I'm narrowly focused. I'm very much
mm,
aimed on the sales problem, but then I'm able to go wide and to look at things that relate
mm,
to the sales problem. And therefore, when I'm engaging with a client, I'm asking questions of them that are not already answered. And by the same token, you might be in a field where diagnostic, is not a highly technical, of high technical degree or importance. So when, for example, when we were working with a systems integrator in London, quite a large one, you would know the name because it's international. But with this systems integrator, they were having a lot of problems with when they were selling, they would sell it at a certain price. And then they would
mm,
always have cost overruns because it was inaccurately diagnosed. It was the requisites weren't correct. And what we did is we slowed down the selling process so that we got a more accurate picture. Now, sometimes when you're selling a diagnostic, that can be $100,000 to $200,000 piece of work,
mm,
just like on a systems integration on a large ERP system, let's say. Then that's going to be a separate piece of work that's going to be really important to take a look at. But even in that case, you're going to have one company that's going to look at it
mhm,
one way, and another company is going to look at it differently about how that problem can be diagnosed and tackled. But for us, in the way we look at it, we know that in sales, we see things a certain way. And if we're, if we lack the confidence that the problem is accurately diagnosed, we know the ways to ask the questions to get people to realize that we know things that they
mm,
haven't considered yet, just simply by asking the question or leading the conversation into that direction.
mm,
Tell me, could I ask a few questions? Tell me, for example, when it comes to
mhm,
this, how do you do that? And people go, that's a really good question. And it's a way of demonstrating your expertise. And it's a way of indicating, look, you haven't turned over every rock. Okay. And since you don't know the answer, that's an indicator that what I'm
mm.
asking for actually
So
is needed.
in with the equation, the last component is execution. If I'm not mistaken, and
Mm.
correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of organizations focus on outputs rather than inputs. Would you, as in dealing with the execution side of things, suggest that sales leaders should really focus more on specific input metrics that you've found to be more predictive of future sales success?
Yes, absolutely.
Hmm.
Especially in more transactional type of lower value, higher cycle or fast cycle selling. In that situation, you definitely want to take a look at what the inputs are
Hmm.
that drive the outputs. Okay. For example, up in Bangladesh, the client I was mentioning before, we looked at basically there are 3
Hmm.
things that drive sales, and that's it. There's only 3 things in essentially is number 1 is how many people are looking at it
Hmm.
or how many people you're approaching. Number 2, how many conversions are you making, right? How many people are
Hmm.
buying? And then thirdly, how many sellers are selling? So that's it. That's the only way you can drive sales, those three things. So we found out, and I did this actually, I did the research on this. I actually was in Bangladesh about a year ago, a little over a year ago, actually sitting in the field in 40-degree heat, 41, 42-degree heat outside under 10. It was quite hot. And just observing and seeing how they were doing their vision camps, et cetera. And I saw that how inefficient it was and how they weren't approaching enough people to come to the vision camps. So what we've done is we've actually increased the number of people going to vision camps from an average of 18 to just over 30. And that's going to keep going higher as we continue to get the marketing right on this. And then, of course, the conversion rate has gone up to just shy of 80%. So it jumped from below 50 to just above 80 or just below 80. And you start looking at those metrics with that. Okay, so one is telling me, are you actually going out approaching clients, and are you approaching enough clients? The second metric is telling me, are you doing a good job at converting those clients? And so therefore it helps me to understand where to look in order to develop you into a higher performer. Okay. It tells me if you're a hard worker, it tells me you're not. And so those in highly transactional, rapid cycle selling, absolutely, those input numbers are really important. In B2B selling, where it's more of a complex environment or a multiple call sale, where you're going to find where the metrics you're looking for are going to be in the CRM. Okay. And most companies, because of the ubiquitous nature of CRMs, you've got an awful lot of CRMs out there to choose from, and they're very, very low cost, some free for very small companies. So I have this great tool that I can lay out in this case, the DQ selling steps. We don't just lay out 4 steps. We lay out somewhere between 8 to 12 steps, some of those steps in each of the stages. So for example, we might have 3 steps in the first stage. We might have 2 steps in the second stage or 4 steps in the third stage, et cetera. It's customized to each client. Then what we do is we bake that into the CRM. And so therefore, this is how a salesperson tracks their progress with a client. Okay. And it's always done from the perspective of the client. What would a client be doing if they were making a really intelligent decision? What would they be doing? Now, they don't know necessarily what that should be. If we're thinking creatively, or we're thinking big about this, and we know our product and we know the things to look for and what needs to be done in order for a client to make a great decision. And by the way, that's the distinction that DQ selling is from all of the selling. And that is, we're committed to helping clients make the very best possible decision for themselves and their companies or their organizations or their families. Okay. Our job is not to convince them, but our job is to help them make the best possible decision. It's a very big distinction in selling. But in a CRM, you've got those stages. And so you can see how many deals are in the pipeline, and how many have advanced to what stages. So you can see the pipeline value at each stage. And so the size of the deal, how it's progressing, you can see when it started, how fast it's progressed. Is it going too fast? Okay. In other words, the salesperson is getting out over his skis, so to speak, and moving the sale along too quickly. Or is it, on the other hand, is it really slowed down, or even has it stalled? So the CRM gives visibility, just like it gives visibility to the B2B sales process that is more of a staged sale versus the transactional sale, which is more, it's a one call close. And so how are people doing with each of the pieces of that one call? You see. Now, the trick is, how do you get salespeople to use the CRM? I mean, it's legendary. Companies come up with these CRMs. They pay a lot of money for systemizing and customizing and all this kind of stuff, only to have to ride the backs of the salespeople with the proverbial whip and get them to actually enter the data into the CRM. Because most companies see the CRM as a management tool. And we don't see it that way. We see that as the booby prize. Okay. What we see the CRM as a sales planning tool. It helps me plan how I'm going to sell each of my clients. So this customer has given me access. That's step 2 in our selling process, has given me access to other people in their business to help diagnose the problem. That's a great sign. Or I'm sorry, that's step 3. Step 2 is they agree to have a meeting, or they have a meeting based on the problem. So that's great. Okay. Once they've done that, I've advanced it into the 3rd stage, which is the stage I'm working on, is getting them to help give access to other people in the business. And so that's what I know that I'm working on. And then once I get that, then has the customer bottomed out the problem? So I know exactly where I am in the process, and I know that's what I need to be focusing on. So therefore, I'm planning on meetings and who I need to meet in there, and et cetera, in the business in order to get a full 360-degree view of the problem. And then I know my next step is to go after the cost of the problem. So if I use it as a sales planning tool, and I've got maybe 30 different deals I'm working on, or 20 deals, or whatever it might be, sometimes only very few, then I'm always organized on where I am in the process and what I'm pursuing, what I'm doing next. And I enter that data into the CRM. And then when I update it after I've done that action, then I have a next action that I've negotiated with a client. And then that's in the CRM, and that's where I'm going next. You see what I'm saying? And so therefore, management has fresh information, it's up to date, and it's more trustworthy. And so therefore, the management get what they're looking for as well, which is management information. They want to see what's going on in a salesperson's pipeline. So those are the inputs. That's the visibility of inputs.
If I remember correctly, you also talked about, in implementing a methodology with clients, that you emphasize embedding rather than just training. For sales leaders who are considering something of a transformation initiative, what does effective embedding look like in practice?
Yeah, exactly. Let me tell you, the case for embedding is that in the United States, a couple of years ago, I was on another podcast, and we were discussing the cost of sales training in the United States was some $19 billion. And my host, who's very savvy about sales, basically said, and what do we have to show for it? Not a whole lot. And that really is what distinguishes sales training from what we do as sales consultants. Okay. Sales consultants are looking at the holistic picture of what are the problems you're trying to solve and what are the causes of those problems, you say. And training then becomes a solution to very well-defined problems. And that training is customized to specifically match up to that problem. Okay. Whereas sales training is oftentimes not really customized deeply because there's not been the discovery that's needed to be. It's a different viewpoint. And oftentimes it ends up being more like a sheep dip, as they say in the UK, right? And so therefore, people are trained and then they're thrown back out into the field. Managers haven't been trained on how to manage their people differently so that they can manage them in the way that their salespeople have now been trained. And so the manager basically says, just go back and do what you were doing before, or manages them into doing what they were doing before. So sales training rarely sticks by itself. So therefore, we want to take more of a holistic viewpoint of what is the selling system and what are the components that are contributing to underperformance. And then B, we want to design training, and that's in attitude, competence, and execution, not generic grayscale sales training that comes off the shelf. And C, we then want to devise an embedding program that involves the managers, and managers need to be trained, first of all. They're trained in the sales program that we've devised. They're trained in the management program that we've devised for that company of how managers develop their people and hold them accountable and turn them into fabulous performers. And then we work with those managers during embedding by coaching those managers and also the key leader, could be the head of sales, could be the CEO, to coach them on how to coach their people. For example, the wrong question to ask during the selling season is, how much is a deal worth and when is it going to close? That'll drive salespeople mad, especially when someone has just made their first sales call on a deal that's going to take 6 months or 3 months or 12 months to close. I have no clue how large the sale could be. I've just had 1 meeting or 2 meetings or 3 meetings. and I really don't know when it's
Mhm.
going to close because I haven't gotten deep enough into this. Now, that's an appropriate question to ask when you get up into the seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, probably about the seventh step of the DQ selling process.
Mm.
When you get into solutionizing, that's an appropriate question to start asking. The right questions to ask are, what stage is the customer at? Have they skipped any steps? What is the
Mm.
very next step? Okay. Those questions need to be asked over and over again by the sales manager. And that's how a sales manager knows whether or not a
Mm.
deal's on track or off track. And then that's presents a learning or coaching opportunity for the sales manager to work with that person. Okay. And so that's, we always ask, what stage is the customer at?
Mm.
Have they skipped any steps? What's your very next step? Because if they've skipped a step, sometimes you have to follow the customer's lead and you slide through to get to the next step because they're unwilling to take the step that you're asking them to take. Then that's one floor of a
Mm.
building that's missing, right? So if you're building an 8-story building and you're at the third step or the third floor, and there is no
Mm.
third floor, you have a problem, don't you?
Mm.
Okay, the building is going to collapse, right? So just like that, the sale is going to collapse, or it has a very high chance of collapsing. Whereas if someone has skipped a step or slid through a step, then you very, very creatively figure ways and work with your sales manager, figure out how to go back and retrace that step to make
Mm.
sure that it's solidly in place, or else the deal has a high chance of slowing down or collapsing altogether. We say that when you sell in a DQ way, there's basically three things that happen. Number one, deals tend to be larger because they're more comprehensive. You see, the diagnosis is more comprehensive. So they tend to be larger. They tend to move faster, not in the first
Mhm.
few steps, but toward the end of the sale or the second half of the sale. They tend to move faster because clients are more confident and they're more confident in you. And then the third thing is the closing percentage is much higher. So in other words, the
Mhm.
deals are more certain. And so therefore those three things combined
Mm.
are great benefits to companies.
That makes a lot of sense as well. Scott, I think we've only just touched or covered the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. There's a lot more we could get into.
Oh, sure.
To wrap up this episode, in the space of
Yeah.
DQ selling in order to scale revenue growth, do you find there's perhaps a couple of areas that leaders in organizations gloss over or don't don't give much airtime to? If so, what would they be?
Yeah. It depends
Mhm.
on the size of the company. Okay. Because we work
Mhm.
with all sizes of companies. I've mentioned some big gargantuan international global companies. We
Mhm.
also work with little tiny companies like organization called IntelliHealth in India that
Mhm.
does telemedicine, right? And when we started working with them, they'd what they were doing is they had a number of use cases through their app, and they were very small and had a very small team of about 5 or 6 people,
Mhm.
and two of them were selling, and that's it. The CEO, founder, and then the head of technology, and that was it, right? And they knew they didn't know
Mhm.
how to sell, but they had a great product. And when we met them 4 years ago, they had about
Mhm.
75,000 use cases. In other words, 75,000 telemedicine appointments that had been completed. And so then we worked with them. We showed them how not to start sharing their technology up front and begin pitching it right away, but instead
Mhm.
follow the problem led conversation and then diagnose it accurately and then present your solution in a future meeting. That first year, their use
Mhm.
cases shot up to over 1 million in 1 year, literally, from the time that we started working with them. And then the next year, they
Mhm.
added 2 million more. So they doubled their sales from the previous year. And then last year was their third year,
Mhm.
and they hit 10 million total. So they added 7 million
Mhm.
use cases in 1 year. And that's because of selling their software and their services to multiple states in India, you say. But it's because they then gain the confidence of and know-how of how to do it. So I tell you that story because A, it's a small company, but the way that they're selling is
Mhm.
just like the big companies that we've taught. and trained. So the selling method is no different in a really small company or in a developing world or global South company versus a highly commercial company in a Western context. So the places where I think organizations falter is, number one, is they fail to appreciate the science of selling, that there actually is a science of selling that greatly increases and enhances the chances of making a sale. So selling is interesting in the sense that, unlike engineering or accounting or whatever, is that like when you invent something and you've tested it and you know it works, you can just replicate it every time over and over again. In accounting, you learn techniques, services, formulas that return the right answer every single time. In sales, it's not that way. Sales is more like sport in the sense that you've got to take a lot of shots in order to get enough to land that you win, right? In American baseball, for example, a hitter that hits 330 average, 330 average, 1 out of 3 at bats is a base hit or a home run or whatever. That's considered really good. That means they're missing it 2/3 of the time. Sales is very much the same way. It could be that in a particular industry, 1/3 of the people that you're calling on are actually going to buy from you, or 110, or 1/20th, or 1/5. It depends on what you're selling. But the requirement is so important to understand the science of selling your particular product in the environment you're working in. It's absolutely critical. And the only way people are really going to learn that is if they're trained on how to do that. Okay. Being a salesperson is incredibly frustrating in the beginning for most people because they may even have a sales school that they go to the company, or it's an external provider. They get the how to, if you know that expression, the how to, but they don't have the know-how, which is how do you use the how to? How do you apply it in all these different circumstances? So that leads me to the second part, which is not only do you need to do the how to, but you need to also impart the know-how. And the way you do that is by either the founder-led seller working with a sales team to teach them how to apply the selling methodology that they use, or the head of sales or sales manager who then works with the salesperson in the field. So the problem is that most salespeople don't get enough attention, especially in the early days, while they're learning how to be a salesperson for a particular company. And so sales managers need to have enough bandwidth to be able to work with their people and develop their people in the field. And I would say the third thing that they make a mistake of is they don't spend enough time with the people who are their performers. Okay. In other words, people who are doing average to above average and excellent, those people need our attention as well. If you want to build loyalty on your sales team, if you want those people that you've invested a lot of time and effort to get up to that level and probably invested a lot of money, if you lose one of those people, it's going to take a long time to replace their performance and their productivity. So therefore, be sure you take care, not just financially, but take care of the people who are your middle and upper echelon people who have stuck around for a while and can make a career out of this with your company, because they want your attention. They crave your acknowledgement of their contribution to your company. And it doesn't always have to be monetary, but it could be just buying somebody a lunch. It could be taking them out and just saying, look, let's not talk about the business. Let's talk about you. How are you doing? How are you holding up? I know you lost your father last year. Tell me about that and the impact on your family. That's what I mean by culture from your earlier question. AI can't do that easily, right? You build a culture of care within your business. And this is very important, whether it's the founder or the sales manager or the head of sales, how big the company might be, is that the people who work for you are your customers, and you should treat them as such. Don't treat them as employees, treat them as customers. Because if you treat them in the right way, guess what? They're going to treat their customers in the right way, because you're modeling that for them about how you listen to them. They're going to turn around and listen to their customers just like you want them to, you see. So there's a lot to building a really great sales organization. I think there's a lot more to it than most people can appreciate. And this is very true in the developing world, in the global South. I'm sure you've heard about the big changes in
Yeah.
funding now, where the
Mhm.
USAID has pulled the funding, and there's going to be a drastic drop in the other countries that fund. And so therefore it's causing what we call social entrepreneurs, or organizations that are do-gooding organizations, to figure out
Mm.
how to sell in order to survive, because there's not enough philanthropic money to go around, so they need to generate their own. And so this whole movement of what we call social enterprise has caught the attention of social entrepreneurs to realize, now I have to really worry about the enterprise side of my name.
Mm.
I got the social part right. Now I need to worry about the enterprise and make sure that what I'm building is actually sustainable and actually will deliver the impact that I really want to deliver in the world. We didn't talk that much about
Mhm.
our impact side of our business, but it's almost everything
Right.
that we do nowadays is in the impact space.
And I'd love to do another episode to cover aspects of that. Scott, like I said,
Great.
we've just touched the tip of the iceberg here. But if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be the key takeaway for you?
I'm not the listening audience, but I've worked with enough people who've listened to us long enough. I think the key
Mhm.
takeaway would be to listen. And I certainly haven't been modeling that. You
Mm.
have been today. But you've been asking me questions. The impact is for me to answer those questions to the best of my ability. But I think the key takeaway is to realize that there is much more to
Mhm.
selling, and it starts with listening, not talking better,
Okay.
not convincing better,
Uh,
but listening better. Yeah. And the audience can find out more about the techniques we're talking about through Amazon Kindle publishing. They can get hold of our books.
mhm.
If people are in B2B selling, they want to pick up decision intelligence selling. That's with a blue cover. If they're in B2C selling,
Mhm.
no matter what, it's in the developing world or in the Western world, then they want to pick up the text called, or the book called
Okay.
Sell Do Good, which is geared more for social
Okay.
enterprises, but
Both
it's also
available on
B2C.
Amazon, major book retailers, I would imagine.
Barnes and Noble's online, mostly online, like the
Okay.
Kindle version or the soft version you can get. Or if you want a hardback or a soft paperback, then Amazon Books and Apple
Okay.
Books
We'll
are
include
ones that
links
you
to
can
that in the
get.
show notes. But if they wanted to find out more about you or connect with
Thank you.
you, where else would you recommend they head to?
Yes, to me directly. Just write Scott at
Okay.
wrpartnership.com, as Scott with two T's, at wrpartnership.com. And might I add also, Vinay, is that we have a free sales diagnostic that people
Mhm.
can access on our website. And it's pretty obvious in the links and everything. And they can go on there and they can take a sales diet. It's a 25 question yes, no set of questions that will take literally,
Hmm.
most of them are done in less than 3 minutes. Okay. So if you're an owner of a company or a sales manager, or even a rising sales star that wants to be in sales management, go there. And what will happen is you'll immediately get back a profile based on your answers and scores in 5 key areas. One is attitude, one is competence, one is execution,
Hmm.
one is sales enablement, and one is in sales management and leadership. And it's our professional assessment when these questions are answered in a certain way, and then you combine the answers, then it'll produce a unique report. So first you'll get a spidergram that'll show you the strengths and weaknesses. And then secondly, in a couple of days thereafter, you'll get a customized 16-page report that'll give you an analysis of your situation and then also some steps you can take, and then an invitation for a free
Okay.
consultation if you so desire. So that's again, totally free
Okay. Is
offering
there a
that you can
social
get on
media
our website.
platform that you tend to prefer? Okay.
We focus mostly on LinkedIn. So Whitten Roy Partnership on LinkedIn. I'm also on LinkedIn as well as Facebook. I think
Okay.
no, we're
X
not.
now.
We're on
But
Twitter.
yeah.
Sorry. So I don't handle that for our
No
company.
worries at
Somebody
all.
else
But
handles it.
we'll put LinkedIn in there as well in the show notes. Scott, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sounds great. Vinay, thank you very much for the invite. It's been well worth the wait to get online with you.